Good afternoon from the United States Embassy in Rome, Italy. I'm Rakesh Surampudi, the cultural attaché at the embassy, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you today for this conversation with distinguished American author Andrea Lee on race, identity, and Black history. I've had the opportunity to follow Andrea's writing for some time, and she's one of contemporary literature's fascinating voices. She's the author of many books, including the National Book Award nominated memoir, Russian Journal, the novels Red Island House, Lost Hearts in Italy, and Sarah Phillips, and the story collection Interesting Women. She's also written for The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, Vogue, W, and the New York Times Book Review. Each February, the United States celebrates African American History Month, also known as Black History Month. This annual observance recognizes important achievements by African Americans in U.S. history and the profound impact Black Americans have had on all aspects of American life. The long struggle of Black Americans for freedom, dignity, and full participation in American society has not only shaped our country, but has also resonated throughout the world we live in today. Over the years, other countries have started to observe Black History Month and recognizing the contributions of individuals from the African diaspora. But Black History Month is not just about celebrating Black American contributions from the past. It's also about making progress on the long journey towards racial equity and equality. By remembering our history, we can pave a road towards a better future. So now let me extend a warm welcome to our moderator, Fabrizio Noli from Radio Rai, and in particular to our guest speaker, Andrea Lee, who is connecting today from the United States. Thank you all for joining us today, especially the TESOL High School students, LUMSA University and ISNA members, and others in Italy for what promises to be a great discussion. Over to you, Fabrizio.
Grazie per questa opportunità appunto che mi avete dato per parlare di un'autrice, con un'autrice di grande interesse, anche per quello che ho potuto leggere insomma in questi giorni di preparazione. Ricordiamo anche a tutti gli astanti, insomma al pubblico, che può appunto inviare domande tramite YouTube e Facebook per iscritto, e appunto vorrei intanto dare il benvenuto a Andrea Lee, anche io come moderatore, e ricordando appunto che il tema dell'incontro è quanto mai attuale e affascinante, secondo me, parlare cioè di razza, identità e storia americana. Andrea Lee, tra l'altro, vive in Italia dal 1992 a Torino, quindi ha una prospettiva secondo me molto ampia sul fronte del discorso identitario, perché appunto il confronto anche tra culture diverse, quella europea italiana e quella americana della costa est, la riguarda direttamente. Andrea, se ci sei, appunto, ti darei direttamente a te la parola, perché appunto è uscito da poco questo testo, Red Island House, di cui ieri ho potuto leggere le prime pagine, che danno in qualche modo già sin dall'inizio in qualche modo un'idea del modo di scrivere di Andrea e dei temi che vengono affrontati appunto nella sua opera letteraria, appunto il tema della razza, del confronto, il tema dell'identità è un tema molto sentito, e vorrei appunto dare la parola ad Andrea per sentire da lei, dalla sua viva voce, appunto direttamente, in qualche modo darci l'opportunità di conoscere meglio la sua opera dalla lettura di un piccolo estratto della sua ultima fatica letteraria. Andrea Lee.
Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be here today. I'm talking to you from Philadelphia, from Swarthmore College, and I'm thrilled and honored to be invited to talk a little bit about my work and about race and culture in general. And so I thought that I would read a bit from my latest book, Red Island House, which just came out it came out almost a year ago now. And it's set in Madagascar. So what I thought I would do without further ado is to read to you from the very first chapter, which kind of introduces this theme of colonialism, of old and new, of a Black woman confronting Africa, of many cultural collisions. I'll read briefly and then we can have a chat. I could talk to Fabrizio and answer anyone's questions. Again, I'm thrilled to be here. So I'm going to, without further ado, I'm going to be reading from Red Island House, just the beginning. It begins with a quote from the national epic of Madagascar called Ibonia, which is a long epic poem that started out as an oral epic, so no one knows how old it is. I am a big house seen from afar. Not even a whole crowd can take it apart. But if they do, it takes revenge. And when those from across the sea catch sight of me, I add them to my servants. There are houses you don't want that nevertheless enter your life and bring with them other lives, whole other worlds. There are countries you visit that lay hold of you and don't let go, even if you diligently attempt to remain a tourist. These thoughts have been incubating in the mind of Shay Senna ever since she, a Black American woman with scant interest in the continent of Africa, except as a near mythical motherland, unexpectedly and unwillingly became mistress of the Red House, a sprawling household in northwestern Madagascar. It is because of the big house and its bad fortune that she is at present in a dreamlike situation, hurrying under the calescent sub-equatorial sun through the back lanes of a fisherman's shanty town on the island of Naratrani, in pursuit of a tiny Sakalava girl in a white satin gown. In the light-soaked stillness of the hottest noontime hour, when mongrel dogs lie flat as puddles and patches of shade, the barefoot child, who looks like an eerie carnival figure in that glaring dress with its flounces and ribbons, skips in and out of sight through a maze of tottering bamboo huts. Occasionally, she turns her little braided head and makes a cheeky beckoning motion with a spindly brown arm as she guides Shay and Shay's head housekeeper, Bertine Lagrade, to the home of the man referred to, usually in whispers, as the neighbor. The tall, stately Bertine, also barefoot, also Sakalava, leads the way. Dressed in a sweeping print lamba, her geometrically knotted hair hidden by a big, sun-faded newsboy hat that gives her a curiously regal air. She chuckles softly each time the small white apparition flashes into sight, then treads on casually, as if engaged in an everyday errand. Shay stumbles along in her wake, hampered by the long skirt she was told to wear, and hobbled as well by her American common sense, which is struggling with the awareness that she's crossed a threshold into the deep unknown. Her woven shoulder bag, concealing a wad of Ari bills and a small gift, bangs against her side as she tries not to think of the fact that she's seeking out the neighbor, a notorious conjure man, in hopes that he can lift the spell on her house. How has this peculiar quest come about? You could say it is because of something that hasn't come about, the housewarming ceremony that Shay's husband, Senna, a rich but frugal Italian businessman, neglects to hold when he finishes building his fantasy vacation residence on Naratrani. So thrifty is Senna that not even one zebu bull is slaughtered for the local villagers, not one festive step danced, not one glass of rum poured on the ground for thirsty ancestors. When the last thatch has been laid on the big villa he constructed on what was formerly Colonel Andrea Solo's lot on Finuana Beach. And so the islanders, the fishermen, charcoal burners, cane workers, hotel maids, gardeners, mechanics, market vendors, prostitutes, wood carvers, middle-class shopkeepers, and professionals observed this neglect of custom and propriety without rancor, but with a sense of inevitable consequences. Particularly the Sakalava people feel this way. They are the abiding ones. the teratani, residents essential to the place as volcanic bedrock for generations, washed over by the caprice and varied abuses of the vazaha, as they call the foreigners who come and go on the land. These locals watch unsurprised as the Red House begins, even before it is furnished, to accumulate an evil atmosphere. It happens bit by bit, just as dust and litter build up in the quarters of an unswept room. And finally, as is so often the case, it becomes a woman's job to clean things up. So there's my excerpt from the beginning, and the rest of the book goes on to describe her relationship with this big house, which is kind of the symbol of what happens when foreigners kind of come into a land very strange to them. So that's the beginning of Red Island House.
Dunque io direi che già da queste prime pagine, poi potrò anche tradurre brevemente in inglese, c'è questo tema, confronto tra culture, che la protagonista fondamentalmente si pone in confronto sia nella sua identità afroamericana con le varie identità malgasce del Madagascar presenti, le 19 etnie presenti sull'isola, sia bene o male anche con il marito. Questo è anche un aspetto forse interessante da sottolineare. Questo uomo del nord, si capisce chiaramente, del nord industriale italiano, molto diverso anche dal resto del paese, che si è fatto da solo, molto cinico. So, you said that you write about intersecting cultures, about even culture clash, say, but how does it come from? Da dove viene questo tuo interesse per le altre razze, le altre culture, le altre identità, Andrea Lee?
Okay. I would say, Fabrizio, that it comes from something I've lived my entire life, which is to live between cultures. I grew up in, let me just take a glass of water here.
Too many questions altogether.
Yeah, good, great. I grew up in a very middle-class Black family in America, which is not necessarily the idea that people have of Black people in America, in a very middle-class Black community, where most of our parents were very involved in the civil rights movement, but also sent their children to schools that were mainly white schools. So I was always used, from the time I was little, to being the only Black person, the only person of color in an environment that was, to me, almost a foreign country, yet it became familiar. As I became a writer, I always found myself traveling, writing about my traveling. I came to Italy at a certain point in my life and became married into an Italian family, and find myself always considering what things from two sides, from different sides of cultures, from sides of different cultures. So I lived in Russia as a student, where I felt most foreign of all, perhaps, and I wrote my first book about the sort of confrontation between my thoughts and what was still the Soviet Union. So it's always been something that's interested me, that's obsessed me, that I've lived in. Now that I've raised children who are bilingual, bicultural, it's just part of my life and what I always write about.
That's very fascinating, and I think that as a Black American, you've been living in Italy for 30 years, no? And talking about the cultural confrontations, how do you compare attitudes toward Black people in Italy to experiences of Black people living in America? And chiederei appunto, alla luce di queste variegate esperienze di Andrea Lee, anche un confronto, diciamo, culturale anche sul razzismo, in qualche modo. Il razzismo visto da un'afroamericana che vive in Italia e quindi che sperimenta forse anche in Italia una forma di razzismo, e il razzismo nel resto dei paesi dove ha vissuto, dove ha potuto vivere appunto esperienze di vita. Hai parlato anche della Russia. Ricordo naturalmente a chi ci sta ascoltando che può appunto inviare domande scritte su YouTube e via Facebook anche. So, your answer. Sorry if I was long.
Well, I think we could talk all afternoon, all evening, and for a week about about that topic. So I will just have to sort of begin it and sketch things out. Of course, I have lived in Italy and between Italy and America, always working in America for a long time. So as a Black American, I've always lived with the idea, the concept of racism. My parents were very active, in my entire family, even for several generations back, were very involved in civil rights, in the concept that African Americans are not given the same privileges as other Americans of different colors, as white Americans in general. So I'm very familiar with that concept and grew up with that concept, although I had a very comfortable childhood. Living in Italy, I've had certainly encounters with racism. I know that Italy has its own problems with racism, but this could go on for all night, but as far as I can see, it is a different sort of problem in Italy. I don't want to go into politics in general, but what I see is, in general, it's not as ingrained in Italy as it is in America. It's not as traditional. It's not as deeply rooted. I think that in Italy, the racism I've encountered has mostly been out of ignorance, out of kind of curiosity about the other. And also the racism I've observed and I've talked with friends about in Italy has mostly sprung from a kind of anxiety about class and economics problems, which are, on the rise in Italy as they are in America as well. So it's a kind of a different feeling. Frederick Douglass, our great, American Black hero, said of Italy that it was a place where he could walk on the street as any man could walk. He said this, years and years ago, decades and decades, a century ago, he said it. So I think it's not as deeply ingrained in Italy as it is in America, is the short answer.
Capisco, avrete capito la risposta, di Andrea Lee sul problema anche del razzismo in Italia, ma indubbiamente non possiamo io personalmente non posso che condividere il suo punto di vista. C'è un fenomeno meno consolidato sicuramente che in America storicamente, parlando. Ricordo ancora appunto, se volete inviare domande potete farlo per iscritto sempre via YouTube o via Facebook. Un'altra domanda che viene spontanea, che sorge spontanea, che tradurrò in inglese: il tema del Madagascar. Allora, non è la prima volta che Andrea Lee scrive del Madagascar, è vero, è un posto che conosce, ma è un posto effettivamente particolare che ti pone davanti ad una necessità di confronto culturale e etnico costante, perché sono ben 19 le etnie del Madagascar, che non è Africa Motherland, come scrive la stessa Lee all'inizio del suo romanzo, ma è una sorta di pezzo di Africa che è andato a collidere contro l'Indonesia, perché appunto ha anche un'identità indonesiana. L'identità malgasia è un po' un mix tra quella Bantu e quella indonesiana, polinesiana, chiamiamola austronesiana. Ma rivolgo ad Andrea la domanda anche in inglese: why do you like writing so often about Madagascar? It's just your personal experience, or also the need of how could we say, the opportunity of a constant confrontation with other cultures, with other races, and it's from what I get, it's a totally different story in comparison with other trips that you could do to the African motherland, or something. It's a totally different situation, but also more stimulating. Could we define it like this?
Well, it's all very interesting. I started writing about Madagascar unwillingly. I did not want to write about Madagascar because I didn't feel that I had enough expertise. This was some years ago when I began to travel there. I have always gone to Madagascar as a visitor, as a sojourner, as a longtime vacationer. And I thought it was not proper for me to write about a culture that is so interesting. And you can't say a culture because there are so many different types of ethnia, of tribes, of peoples indigenous peoples in Madagascar. I thought I was too ignorant. I thought that it was disrespectful. So, but going there year after year, making friends, seeing situations that fascinated me, mainly with foreigners who come to live in Madagascar and mix with the culture, which is a subject I know very well. I began to be fascinated by the idea of writing something about what I saw. So I began to collect anecdotes, and I eventually wrote, I wrote one story for the New Yorker, and then I began to write Red Island House, which is a novel in a series of stories. I think that because Madagascar, as we know, it's a huge country. It's also one of the poorest countries in the world. It's a fascinating culture that you cannot say, as Fabrizio has said, it's very hard to define. It's even unique in its natural life, in its biodiversity, in its geological history. And so it's a country that it's hard to generalize about. It's another thing that held me back from writing about it. But I thought I could find a way to write about the interactions of foreigners with Madagascar, which is what I ended up doing. Because from time immemorial, because Madagascar is in the Indian Ocean, it's been visited by foreigners, by slave traders, by pirates, it was a French colony and an English colony, by many, many people who thought that they could use something from Madagascar. So it makes all of that interaction with the outside world to a country that's so unique was very interesting to me. And I thought as a foreigner, I could write about that. So in fact, it's a little known fact, but even Hitler just thought of using Madagascar as a concentration camp early in the Holocaust. And so everyone had an idea of some use, usually destructive, for Madagascar. I thought I could write about that.
Sì, no, in effetti è un'isola incredibile per certi versi, a parte per le dimensioni che è più grande della Francia, ma tra la presenza a livello di fauna dei lemuri, no? Che sono gli antenati delle scimmie, questa natura così deserta che passa dai deserti più aridi alle giungle più lussureggianti, il tutto alla fine in un territorio comunque non enorme, insomma, è indubbiamente affascinante, ma tornerei sul tema del razzismo, Andrea, perché insomma tu ti occupi molto di confronto culturale, etnico, di confronto con l'altro. Da afroamericana che comunque vive in Italia da da ormai 30 anni, quanto ti hanno impressionato i recenti sviluppi in America, il Black Lives Matter, tutto quello che è successo? A me personalmente ha molto colpito il fatto che la morte di Floyd fosse stata causata da un poliziotto a Minneapolis, insomma a Minnesota nel nord degli Stati Uniti. Fosse accaduto in Alabama o in Missouri forse ci avrebbe colpito di meno a noi europei. What do you think about the recent developments of racism in US, the Black Lives Matter movement? Did you expect it to start from Minnesota, which is a northern state, let's say, no? Not Alabama or Missouri. E ripeto poi, chi vuole fare domande, chi vuole porre domande ad Andrea, sempre tramite Facebook o YouTube, per iscritto, si senta libero di fare.
Well, thank you, Fabrizio. Well, once again, this is a topic that we could talk for hours on. Possiamo parlare per delle ore su questo tema. Però I think that, obviously, clearly, Black Lives Matter is a for me as an African American woman is a philosophy, is a social movement with which I am in agreement. I'm in agreement, and I understand perfectly how it came about. I am surprised. Well, I'm not surprised, actually. In Europe, I still feel that there's little understanding of the extent of racial tension and problems in the United States. And so the idea that you had, Fabrizio, that it is something that would be only happening in the South, which traditionally happened after the Civil War, with the outburst of lynchings. We have known for decades that there's just as much racial tension and injustice in northern parts of America as there is in the South. And so I was not at all surprised to see, George Floyd's death as, George Floyd's murder, basically, as taking place in a place like Minnesota, because it's very clear that it happens everywhere. Now, I don't really want to go and talk a lot about politics today, but I can assure you that racism is everywhere in the United States, but there's also kind of a hope for. This is a very disrupted period in America, a very troubled period, a very conflicted period in the United States. But I also see it as a time, I'm hoping, a time of communication. And so, as are all periods of kind of chaotic confrontation and hostility in a country. So, there's not much I can say really about it, except that I was not surprised by and am not surprised by outbreaks of violence against Black people in various parts of the United States.
Senti Andrea, questo molto chiara la tua risposta. Mi viene in mente anche un documentario che ho visto recentemente su Netflix su Quincy Jones, in cui appunto il grande musicista e produttore diceva: tutto sommato nel sud si parla di razzismo e c'è razzismo, nel nord non si parla magari di razzismo, ma anche là ci può essere razzismo. Ma comunque, insomma, al di là di queste considerazioni, di questo cultural clash, vorrei tornare. I would like to go back to your Italian experience of life, because it's a long period, 30 years in Italy. Obviously, reaching to. Non sei fissa in Italia, cioè ti passi dagli Stati Uniti all'Italia, spendi dei periodi più o meno lunghi anche negli Stati Uniti, ma diciamo ti sarai fatto un'idea anche della letteratura italiana, no? In questi 30 anni. Chi sono i tuoi scrittori italiani preferiti? Which are you?
Now, first I have to say, thank you, Fabrizio. First, I have to say that I deliberately not developed my Italian reading in Italian as much as some other people who live in Italy, particularly because I think that it damages my English, which is my instrument, il mio strumento. If I involve I speak French and I speak Italian and I speak some Russian, but I think that being too deeply involved in reading another language, in some ways, for some reason, for me, it makes my English less spontaneous. So I've read a lot of Italian literature, but very often I read it in translation. So my favorite writers in Italy are, kind of a great, there's a great deal of variety. I like Tomasi di Lampedusa very, very much, but particularly one short story of his. I love Gattopardo, but one short story of his, which is less known, about a mermaid, which is a marvelous short story. I like Roberto Calasso, who is also a very good friend of mine. Unfortunately, who's departed this last year very much. I wrote about him many times for the New Yorker, and he was a close friend, and I just loved his work. Let's see, who else? Elena Ferrante, Moravia, but Conti Romani particularmente. I like his Roman tales, Roman short stories very, very much. So you can see that I have quite a Pavese, because I live in Torino. So I have kind of an eclectic taste.
And tu sei molto più famosa negli Stati Uniti che non in Italia. È stata una tua scelta in qualche modo di tenere un basso profilo in Italia? You're much more famous, obviously, in the States than in Italy. And was it partially due also to a choice of yours? I mean, you decided to be more, how could you say, private in Italy, or what else?
No, forse ho detto qualcosa, ho accennato qualcosa prima, però ho detto che ho fatto la scelta di fare la vita di famiglia because I'm married to an Italian and I've raised my two children in Italy, in Torino particularly. And I just wanted to divide those two existences in some ways. I wanted to have a family life where I wrote, but I did not want to involve myself in the literary life in Italy. Although, as I said, I became friends with Roberto Calasso, who was the soul and heart of the literary of literature in some ways. So it was a deliberate choice, I think. I worked in America in English because I'm passionately fond of words in English. And I lived my life, and I still do this. I live my personal life, my family life in Italy, although I go back and forth sometimes at Torino, but adesso, and above all. So it's a deliberate choice, I'd say.
Una scelta deliberata, insomma, questo profilo un po'. Ma a questo punto è inevitabile la domanda: com'è che Andrea Lee decide a un certo punto della sua vita di diventare scrittrice? Why did you decide to become a writer? How did you take this decision at a moment, at a time of your life? I mean, how did it happen?
I think I've always been a writer, Fabrizio. I've always written ever since I was little, ever since I could hold a pencil. And even before, I was inventing stories, poems. It's just something that I just always loved to do. And so I was lucky enough to go to very good schools here in Pennsylvania, but also to Harvard, where there were wonderful writing programs, great professors with whom I worked. And it always appeared to me that I would always be writing. I was lucky enough to go to Russia as a very young, as a young student, as a writer. And that gave me something to write about. I've had the good fortune of encountering the New Yorker, having my first work accepted basically by the New Yorker, which is the heart of American literary world. William Shawn was the editor when I was a student, and I sent him my first pieces. He was a legendary figure who encouraged me to go on writing and to write fiction as well as nonfiction. So you could say it's been a lifelong passion. È stata una cosa di tutta la vita.
A proposito, ecco, abbiamo la prima domanda dal pubblico, una domanda di Daniela Kekkovic, credo che si pronunci così, non lo so, non sono un esperto di lingue slave. Why is it so difficult to eliminate racial prejudice nowadays? Perché è così difficile superare i pregiudizi razziali anche oggi, in questi tempi?
Scusi, non ho capito, non ho sentito bene, scusi, puoi ripeterlo, Fabrizio?
Daniela Kektovic, I think that's, I'm not sure. Why is it so difficult to eliminate racial prejudice nowadays?
Again, another domanda piccola. We are having some very large questions. I have no idea why it is so difficult. I could talk forever about prejudice and how to eliminate. And my father, who was a minister, spent his life, was a Baptist minister, spent his life and his Sundays talking about how to eliminate prejudice and how to make people understand each other. So I don't know is the question. We would all very much like to know. I would like to know also if we're talking about racial prejudice in Russia or in general.
Sembra più una domanda di tipo globale che non una domanda limitata agli Stati Uniti, alla Russia o all'Italia. Il razzismo come parte integrante forse dell'identità umana per certi versi, non lo so. Ti faccio questa domanda, te la giro, ma da parte mia partendo da questa domanda di Daniela Kektovic. Siamo tutti in qualche modo un po' razzisti? Questa forse potrebbe essere un altro lato della domanda. I can't hear you.
Oh, okay. This is another one of those eternally difficult questions. I don't know. As I said, we're talking about problems of ethnicity, problems of prejudice, problems of hatred and violence against between nations or between different ethnicities. I'm not quite certain. But how do we eliminate them? I don't know. We have to get to know each other. This all sounds very bland because this is the fundamental problem of international relations. We don't know. And that's what everyone is trying to do and to say.
Okay. Now, after a big answer, after a short question, we have a big question. Adesso, dopo una lunga risposta, ma al tempo stesso inevitabilmente incompleta, ad una breve domanda ma densa di significati, abbiamo una domanda da Facebook di Lee Ann of Poor, credo di sì, si pronunci così. Good afternoon, I'm very pleased to follow this conversation. Sono molto contenta di seguire questa conversazione. I am an American who has lived in Italy 30 years. Da 30 anni questa signora americana vive in Italia. As an English and geography teacher here in Italy, I speak to my students about my experiences with racism as a young white girl growing up in rural Louisiana, and many of my dearest friends were African American. I have introduced the controversial topic of CRT, critical race theory, trying to explain what actually is. But the ignorance of my people using the excuse of CRT to erase Black history from our schools is unacceptable. And I feel strongly about raising awareness, even if it is on a small scale. It would be interesting to hear Mrs. Lee's opinion on this.
Whoa.
It's a long question. I don't know if it's even a longer.
And it's a hot topic too. Once again, it's a big question and a hot topic. Can you hear me? Yeah. Again, I could speak all afternoon and probably not come to a conclusion. It's one of the most controversial topics in America today, one of our sort of cultural topics that no one seems to agree upon. I myself, and I have to plead ignorance, have never actually been able to decipher the actual, I know the critical race theory is theory, but I've never exactly been able to decipher what it is basically, except for the idea of accepting racism and slavery and Black history as part of the fundamental American past, which it wasn't when I was in school and studying history. I knew almost nothing about achievements of Black people or sufferings of Black people or any other race that arrived in the United States. So for me, that is what critical race theory means. And I don't think it's all as controversial as everyone seems to think it is, to accept the idea that some of our founding fathers were slave owners, that I would say almost the majority, or at least a great number of our founding fathers accepted the idea of non-freedom of slavery for Africans who had arrived in the country. That America was not originally conceived for African Americans who became African Americans. So it's a very controversial topic, but I personally don't think it's as complicated as it seems to be, except for scholars. So I absolutely agree that there should be more. It shouldn't be called CRT because it's become a real hot topic in America. There should be more acceptance in curriculums of non-white American history, is what I think. So, and that's all I can really say on the subject.
Yeah, it's a complex answer, I think, very complicated. I think that the whole afternoon wouldn't be sufficient. L'intero pomeriggio non sarebbe sufficiente per dare una risposta a questo tipo di domanda. Vorrei chiedere però, Andrea, se in qualche modo non si sente parte di un'elite, nel senso che hai menzionato Harvard, Ivy League, e nei tuoi scritti si fa spesso riferimento ad un upper Afro-American middle class, let's say, no? alta borghesia afroamericana. Non è un concetto molto di cui si parla molto. Esiste questa alta borghesia afroamericana, ma io personalmente mi ricordo un po' di Robinson, il telefilm degli anni '80, ma insomma sì, si parla molto, che ne so, di multimilionari afroamericani, ma che sono o sportivi o musicisti, ma spesso non c'è molta consapevolezza di una classe medio-alta afroamericana, di una borghesia medio-alta afroamericana. I mean, this concept of an upper Afro-American middle class is not so common, not so well known, at least in Italy. And how do you explain that? Come lo spieghi questo?
Well, I think this, that you can hear me. I'm sorry. Yes. Okay. It's not so well known even in America. That's the interesting part. And I don't exactly know why, because there has been a Black American middle class for decades. Many of the Harlem Renaissance writers and painters were well educated, what you might call elite, because in America, elite translates very often to education, to living in a middle class fashion. Certainly, I grew up in a very comfortable community here in Philadelphia, which was completely Afro-American, surrounded by journalists, by doctors, by lawyers, all in the same small suburban town. Now, it's not very well known, because it's not that people kept to themselves. It's that there's an image of African Americans that has gone abroad as being either entertainers or being a suffering underclass. Now, there are plenty of people who are a suffering underclass who are of color in America, but there's also a middle class. And in general, the people with whom I grew up were constantly fighting and working to improve lives for every Black American. So, and that's what I'm writing about in my next book, which is a memoir about the little town where I grew up, because all of our fathers, all of our mothers were organizing boycotts. My father was a friend of Martin Luther King's, but we were living in a very, very American suburban way, with good education, with nice houses. So it's not so unusual, but it's very little known in Europe, and I can't really explain why.
Because of stereotypes, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, possibly.
Pensa sempre, cioè c'è uno stereotipo che continua ad aleggiare, forse anche nel cinema o in molta letteratura, insomma, che l'afroamericano sia comunque un dannato della terra per certi versi. Abbiamo comunque altre due domande che mi sembrano molto interessanti. Allora, la prima è da Esther, da YouTube. Is there any suggestion from Andrea Lee to educate ourselves on the topic of Black history, race, and identity? Sorry.
Salute. Any suggestion? Wait, I'm sorry. To educate ourselves on
Black history and identity. C'è un modo per conoscere meglio, insomma, questo topic della razza afroamericana, cioè meglio dell'identità fondamentalmente afroamericana, la storia, la razza, l'identità.
Yes, I think that there's never been a better moment to do so, because as I said, this is a period of tension, of cultural tension, of racial tension in America, but it's also a kind of a golden age of multicultural literature, including African-American literature. There are wonderful authors out there, Carolyn Farrell, for example, or Colson Whitehead. You can read novel after novel. They're just a few of the names who are of the people who are writing wonderful fiction about the African-American experience. But it's very easy now to look up the history of African Americans and to see how much African Americans contributed generally to American culture. I myself, Fabrizio, thinking of this conference, looked up how many African Americans studied in Italy over decades and centuries, and artists, writers from the 1800s to nowadays, came to Rome, studied, invented things, architects. So you can find this out looking up things on the internet, where there's never been a better time. And I think you can find a lot and you'll be fascinated by it. I did not know, for example, that Edmonia Lewis, a famous Black American sculptress, lived in Rome for years in the 1800s, nor did I know that a Black American doctor, a woman, one of the first Black American female doctors, lived and worked in Florence for years in the 1800s. So you can find all of these things out. Just do it by doing a little research. It's fascinating.
No, è assolutamente affascinante ed è un capitolo di storia afroamericana poco nota, ma d'altra parte mi riviene in mente che ho citato prima, però se uno ci pensa, proprio nel periodo della lotta dei diritti civili, per i diritti civili di Martin Luther King, venne fuori un film come Guess Who's Coming Dinner, Indovina chi viene a cena, no? Spencer Tracy e Katharine Hepburn, insomma, in fondo anche quello era un confronto culturale, ma era un confronto di alto livello, perché il fidanzato afroamericano della figlia non era non era di basso livello sociale, veniva da un'identità afroamericana upper class, come si può dire, no? Però ecco, ci dimentichiamo di questi aspetti. Sempre su YouTube, da Gigliola Nocera, transnational literature includes today novels by African American writers born and living in Africa. They claim racism in Africa is not based on race, white, black, but on tribe. Do you agree?
Oh, I agree, absolutely. I mean, as I said, in America, we have a particular kind of, every country has its own kind of prejudice. Let's face it, every single country, whether it's class prejudice or tribal prejudice or prejudice against indigenous peoples. And certainly, first of all, we cannot talk about Africa as a monolith because it's a continent made up of many countries. But I would say, of course, that Africa being a place where there are many people of color, Black people, there is clearly not as much racism, colorism and racism. I don't want to say colorism, no. Racism in Africa, there is more, what friction there is class-based or tribal-based. So yes, I do agree.
I tuoi sentimenti quando vai in Africa, e non parlo solo del Madagascar, Big Motherland, il grande madrepatria, o qualcosa di diverso? Andrea Lee, how do you feel when you go to Africa? I mean, what are your feelings? I mean, and I'm not talking about Madagascar.
Interessante. I have been, when I go to West Africa, because most of my ancestors, and I can trace them back very far, many generations, came from West Africa, as did many, many descendants of slaves in America. So when I go to West Africa and I see, certain I feel a great sense of kinship and emotion, although I'm clearly very mixed race and have also Native American blood. So I feel a sense of kinship and part of knowing that part of my history is there. Okay. But in any country where there are people of color, mixed race people, African people of African origin, people from the diaspora, I feel at home. I feel a certain connection because there are people who look like me, who look like my parents or my neighbors, and people who share certain, folk ways. I don't know how to describe it, but I do feel a sense of home and kinship, and even in countries where I don't have a direct blood tie, like Madagascar. And that is one of the themes in my book. My heroine, Shay, thinks that she is connected and knows everything about Madagascar. In fact, she knows nothing. She only feels connected because, as I said, people resemble her, but culturally, she knows nothing about the country, and she begins to learn about it. And that's how I feel in general.
Yes, of course, it's understandable. Però, insomma, questo senso di di affinità tu lo cogli nei confronti, diciamo, soprattutto della zona occidentale, io direi il Golfo di Guinea, no? Guinea Coast, where most of the slaves came, anyway.
Yeah.
Quindi insomma è inevitabile che ci sia, mi viene in mente anche il fatto che la Liberia in inglese, fu fondata appunto sempre sul Golfo, sulla parte occidentale comunque dell'Africa, da un gruppo di schiavi liberati, la capitale appunto non a caso chiamata Monrovia, quindi c'è in qualche modo una continuità. Ma io vorrei tornare però anche di nuovo sulla tua identità di scrittrice, non soltanto scrittrice afroamericana, ma scrittrice e giornalista. Insomma, quali sono i tuoi autori preferiti? Abbiamo parlato dei tuoi autori in lingua italiana, insomma, gli autori italiani preferiti, da Moravia a di Lampedusa. Vorrei capire invece i tuoi autori di lingua inglese, britannici o americani o neozelandesi, non lo so, insomma, i tuoi autori anglosassoni preferiti, definiamoli così.
No, non è necessariamente anglosassone. I love the great Russian writers are my favorites, and because I passionately love short stories, I love Chekhov. My very favorite writer might be Turgenev, but above all, his sportsman's sketches. I like, I don't know, it's an interesting question. Isaac Dinesen, Karen Blixen, but not out of Africa. Her Winter's Tales, her other books. Traditional writers like Hemingway, Faulkner. I grew up studying literature, so I have a passion for above all, as I said, for short fiction, for short stories. So Anthony Trollope in England, from England, many other. I think someone's. Can you hear that? Someone is doing work down below in my apartment. So, can you hear this? Okay. It's lucky we're near the end. I don't know what to tell you. But I think it's over. I don't know. I have no idea. But anyway, I have a great passion. I'm very widely read. As for Black American authors, I love Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes in general, John Toomer, who wrote Cain, which is one of my very favorite books. I read widely, so it's hard to say who's the favorite.
My favorites are, for example, Philip Roth and Paul Auster from US, but I don't know. What do you think about them? I miei autori preferiti americani sono Philip Roth e Paul Auster. Tu cosa ne pensi?
Oh, I love Philip Roth very much. And I was very flattered to say that he really very much liked my writing when he was alive. Philip Roth is is one of our great writers. And so, yes, I love Philip Roth, John Updike, John Cheever. We could just go on and on and on. I'm constantly reading and rereading, especially now that I'm teaching fiction at this college at Swarthmore. So I'm constantly recommending authors.
Abbiamo comunque capito che sei di gusti molto eclettici, dalla Russia ai contemporanei.
Oh, Haruki Murakami, we can say, is one of my very, very favorite writers. Yes.
Un'altra domanda da YouTube. Intanto un commento molto positivo, ringraziamo Riccardo. Pozzo ci dice great presentation, thanks so much. We thank you too for your words. And poi Luisanna Paggiaro, do you think the works belong to post-colonial literature? Do you feel the question of identity is a double question, is painful and you should work on it to come to a sense of self-consciousness?
Forse è meglio tradurlo in italiano che non ho capito. I should work on it to contain a sense of what?
Se tu pensi che il tuo lavoro appartenga in qualche modo ad un tipo di letteratura post-colonialista, pensi che la questione dell'identità sia dolorosa e tu dovresti lavorare ad un livello di autoconsapevolezza in qualche modo sul discorso dell'identità?
I think all writers are looking for kind of self-knowledge, no? But absolutely, I have been told, I write because I write, but I write on the topics I write on. I don't theorize about my own writing, but I have been told that, of course, they do belong to the stratum of post-colonial writing. As I said, as the world shrinks in a certain way, there are more and more writers crossing, of different ethnicities, writing about even mixed ethnicities, writing about their experiences. And mixed ethnicities basically very often come from colonial activity. So yes, we're talking about post-colonial kind of explosion of talent, of people seeking an identity, and certainly, yes, maybe I am seeking an identity. Yes, I would say yes.
I mean, you living here and there, I'm talking here from one side to the Atlantic Ocean to the other one for several months each time, it's even more urgent, this need. But forse questa necessità di cercare un'identità è ancora più forte per Andrea, perché si trova a vivere tra le due sponde dell'Atlantico diversi mesi all'anno da una parte o dall'altra, ma è un'idea. Un'altra domanda da YouTube, sempre da Daniela Kektovic. In your opinion, when does racial prejudice become more evident in our daily life? Quando è che il pregiudizio razziale diventa più evidente nella nostra vita quotidiana di tutti i giorni?
Well, that's an interesting question, Daniela. It is when. No, I can't really say, because for me, it's always a surprise. Sometimes you encounter someone who clearly is displaying racial prejudice, but it's always very surprising to me to be followed around. It happens often to be followed around in a shop because they sort of think that because of the way I look, I might steal. It's always a great surprise. So I don't really know what to say. When you're raising children who are, of color, you have to expect that they will encounter prejudice, and you must talk to them about it. You must talk to them about their heritage and what they can expect. And that's something that as a mother, I have done, with my own children. So it's part of daily life, but also unexpected. So I have no direct answer for that, except that it's a very interesting question.
In effetti, comunque, anche la tua impressione, insomma, mi ha colpito, insomma, che nei negozi magari dove vai, in certi negozi ti possono guardare un po' male per il colore della tua pelle. Questo è una cosa che mi ha colpito, devo dire la verità. Ma altra domanda al professor Lucio Martino. Now, in these days, do you think that Afrocentric education will make Black children less competent in the culture in which they have to compete, as William Raftery, the columnist and Stanford professor, has written? Farei un'altra domanda, così combiniamo, un'altra domanda da Facebook, da Mary Riggio. Can you suggest a movie about Black history from pupils?
A movie about Black history, what? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Movie about Black history, può suggerire un film sulla storia del popolo afroamericano, credo si riferisca a questo, per i miei ragazzi?
Oh, I think there's an interesting take on Black history, which is Colson Whitehead's, which came out recently, which is Colson Whitehead's Underground Railroad, which is more of a fantasy, but it also combines a great deal of Afro-American history. There are many, and it's not coming to my mind. There are many. I can't think of a documentary, but I know that there are many, and a simple search will show you. As for the first question,
Riggio has kept on writing, and she wrote a movie that is not one of the most seen, not like the purple color, for example, non come il color viola, che ne so, something different and new.
Something different and new would be Well, it's hard to say. I mean, in terms, every story about Black people's education, The Color Purple is not think is a good story, but of course it's quite old. How about Moonlight, which won the Oscar? It's an interesting take on it's not Black history, but it is, Black culture in a certain way, a certain type. I cannot tell you. That's a very interesting question that I will have to look for. I know that there are many, many documentaries available. It's that I don't watch them because I spend my time reading so much about them.
We should try to answer also to Professor Lucio Martino. Now, in this day, do you think that the Afrocentric education will make Black children less competent in the culture in which they have to compete, as William Raspberry, the columnist and Stanford professor, has written?
Well, I'm not quite sure what he means by Afrocentric education. Every child should be educated in America. I think that it's probably a myth to say that there could be a widespread Afrocentric education. It should be Afro-inclusive education, because, as I said earlier, for a very long time in many public schools in America in general, there was very little inclusion of Black history, a very little view of Black faces. I certainly, when I was growing up, didn't see any such thing. So that will not make children less competitive. You could not possibly, in a multicultural country like America, have only Afrocentric education. That's something that would not work, because they're not only Black people in America, there are all kinds of, there are Asians, there are people of European descent, there are Native Americans, and so certainly everyone should be included in education for children.
Ok, abbiamo un'altra domanda di tipo educativo, le ultime due domande direi, perché il tempo è un po' tiranno. Antonella scrive: education should be one of the most important keys to start a new mental attitude of the young generation towards racism. What is the American State Education Committee doing about at the moment? Thanks for answering.
I'm having trouble hearing you, Fabrizio. I'm sorry. Maybe I'll turn off my... Could you repeat the question?
She writes, education should be one of the most important keys to start a new mental attitude. L'educazione dovrebbe essere una delle chiavi di volta per una nuova forma di attitudine mentale of the young generation towards racism, delle nuove generazioni verso il razzismo. What is the American State Education Committee? Cosa fa, diciamo, credo l'equivalente del Ministero dell'Educazione americana? What is the American State Education Committee doing about that at the moment?
Okay, this is another one of those very large questions. First of all, education is, America is a huge country and there are many states. And in general, education is, although there is a Department of Education, that education is not necessarily uniform across the United States. Now, I think in general, there is a movement to include more inclusivity, particularly in history, of the various contributions of people of different races, colors, creeds to American history and to America today. I think it's a very good thing. I don't think it's happening in a uniform way, but it is happening slowly, and there's some controversy about it. So, if I were the head of, if I were the king of America, I'd have I'd have history of every particular ethnic group in some ways included in somehow in education, but it's happening sporadically and controversially.
Ancora, diciamo, siamo su un percorso ancora lungo. Abbiamo una terza domanda di Daniela Kektovic. What was, from your point of view, the most powerful and revolutionary speech against racial discrimination? I Have a Dream di Martin Luther King? Non lo so, suggerisco.
Well, that's an interesting question. I think I Have a Dream. as I said, my father knew Reverend King and spent time marching in the South. I believe I Have a Dream. It mesmerized America. Yes. I mean, to me, that's what that speech was epic. Though I was a child when I heard it, I've never forgotten it, and it's always fresh.
It's still fresh after more than 50 years.
Yes.
Incredibly fresh. So it came to me spontaneous. Mi è venuto spontaneo, diciamo, riparlare del grande discorso di Martin Luther King, anche se sono passati quasi 60 anni, insomma, quindi stiamo parlando di un periodo lontano, insomma, ormai. Non so, ecco, se a questo punto possiamo in qualche modo ritenere soddisfacente, diciamo, il tipo di interazione che abbiamo avuto con Andrea Lee, il tipo di riflessione che abbiamo portato avanti, anche di conversazione. Credo che siamo stati, diciamo, in qualche modo, per quanto in un momento di tempo limitato, insomma, ma credo che Andrea Lee sia stata molto chiara, molto esauriente nella sua esposizione a proposito di razze, conflitti razziali anche e diciamo identità di razza e identità afroamericana oggi, anche sotto un punto di vista diverso rispetto a quello che spesso si sente o si pensa, insomma. Soprattutto trovo anche affascinante il modo in cui abbiamo potuto parlare di Africa e di una parte di Africa poco nota come il Madagascar. Quindi non so, insomma, Andrea, credo che abbiamo toccato molti temi, non so se sei soddisfatta, se c'è ancora qualcosa che vuoi aggiungere. Do you want to add something to what we said? It seems to me that
Yeah.
it's a very
let me think. No, I think that these are huge discourses that we have touched on today very lightly and very casually. And you know, and I don't pretend to be a philosopher or any kind of spokesman for any kind of political thought. I write books. I write fiction above all, and then I sometimes write articles. So, but not articles about politics. I think we've touched on some very interesting points. I think we're all very, as I said, I think the world is in confusion, but out of this confusion and, you know, occasional kind of turmoil, I think we're definitely in some kind of, you know, psychological, cultural turmoil. Out of this turmoil is coming a great deal of creativity, a great deal of knowledge, of different cultures coming to know each other, even though, and there's always turmoil when that happens. So I think that my books reflect that. And, you know, it's something that's always important and interesting to talk about. And as I said, we could talk all day and all night and never come to a conclusion, except we have to know each other better. We have to know each other better, our history, our present day existence, and try to tolerate each other and come to know each other. So.
Allora, a questo punto io direi aggiungerei a conclusione di tutto che a volte di un periodo così confuso come quello che stiamo vivendo è meglio parlare con leggerezza piuttosto che con pesantezza. Abbiamo toccato, secondo me, molti punti direi cruciali e importanti, ma in modo leggero, che non vuol dire superficiale. E questo è un punto che vorrei sottolineare, perché comunque ci dà modo di analizzare anche noi stessi in qualche modo. Vorrei chiedere a Rakesh se I would like to ask Rakesh if he has some extra questions, if he wants to ask anything else to Andrea, and if we can eventually conclude this conversation, if you can end this conversation. Rakesh.
Thanks so much, Fabrizio, and thank you so much, Andrea, for spending a good part of, I think, your morning with us and our afternoon. It was a great discussion, and as Andrea said, a lot of things to think about, but really gratifying to hear also that I think having more conversation, engaging with each other, and knowing more about each other, whether that's within the United States or across national borders, is hugely important. So I hope we can keep the conversation going. And I want to thank the both of you and to all the people who tuned in for spending time with us to have these important discussions. So thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much, Rakesh. Thank you for inviting me. It was a great pleasure. Okay, thank you, Fabrizio. Grazie mille, Fabrizio. Era meraviglioso. Okay, thank you. Goodbye.
Bye,
Ciao,
everybody.
thank you.
Ciao, ciao. Arrivederci a tutti.